Welcome to the online lecture series of Professor K.Paul, University Department of English, BRA, Bihar University, Muzaffarpur. Good morning, listeners. Good morning, viewers. So today I am going to discuss on the topic, what is poetry? Poetry is a vast subject, as old as history and older, present wherever religion is present, possibly under some definitions, the primal and primary form of language themselves. The present uh, lecture means only to describe in as general a way as possible certain properties of poetry and of poetic thought regarded as in some sense independent modes of mind. Naturally, not every tradition, not every local or individual variation can be or need be included. Not very tradition, not every local or individual variations can be or need be included, but the lecture illustrates by examples of poetry ranging between nursery rhyme and epic. This lecture considers the difficulty or impossibility of a defining poetry, man's nevertheless familiar acquaintance with it, the differences between poetry and prose, the idea of form in poetry, poetry as a mode of thought, and what little may be said in prose of the spirit of poetry. Poetry is the other way of using language, perhaps in some hypothetical beginning of things, it was the only way of using language, or simply was language tout court, prose being the derivative and younger rival. Both poetry and language are fashionably thought to have belonged to ritual in early agricultural societies, and poetry in particular, it has been claimed, arose at first in the form of magical spells recited to ensure a good harvest. Whatever the truth of this hypothesis, it blurs a useful distinction by the time there begins to be a separate class of objects called poems, recognizable as such. These objects are no longer much regarded for their possible yam growing properties, and such magic as they may be thought capable of has retired to do its business upon the human spirit and not directly upon the natural world outside. Formally, poetry is recognizable by its greater dependence on at least one more parameter, the line, than appears in prose composition. This changes its appearance on the page, and it seems clear that people take their cue from this changed appearance, reading poetry aloud in a very different voice from their habitual voice, possibly because, as Ben Jonson said, poetry speaketh somewhat above a mortal mouth. If, as a taste of this description, people are shown poems printed as prose, it most often turns out that they will read the result as prose simply because it looks that way, which is to say that they are no longer guided in their reading by the balance and shift of the line in relation to the breadth as well as syntax. That is a minimal definition, but perhaps not altogether uninformative. It may be all that ought to be accepted in the way of a definition. Poetry is the way it is because it looks that way, and it looks that way because it sounds that way, and vice versa. People's reason for wanting a definition is to take care of borderline case, and that is what a definition, as if by definition, will not do. That is, if an individual asks for a definition of poetry, it will most certainly not be the case that he has ever seen one of the objects called poems that are said to embody poetry. On the contrary, he is already tolerably certain what poetry in the main is, and his reason for wanting a definition is either that his certainty has been challenged by someone else, or that he wants to take care of a possible or seeming exception to it. Hence, the perennial squabble about the distinguishing poetry from prose, which is rather like distinguishing rain from snow. Everyone is reasonably capable of doing so, and yet there are some weathers that are either neither. Sensible things have been said on the question. The poet T.S. Eliot suggested that part of the difficulty lies in the fact that there is the technical term verse to go with the term poetry, while there is no equivalent technical term to distinguish the mechanical part of prose and make the relation symmetrical. The French poet Paul Vallée said that prose was walking, poetry dancing. Indeed, the original two terms, process and verses, meant respectively going straight forth and returning, and that the distinction does point up the tendency of poetry to incremental repetition, variation, and the treatment of many matters and different themes in a single recurrent form, such as a couplet or a stanza. American poet Robert Frost said shrewdly that poetry was what got left behind in translation, which suggests a criterion of almost scientific refinement. When in doubt, translate whatever comes through in prose. The remainder is poetry. And yet, to even so acute a definition, the obvious exception is a startling and formidable one. Some of the greatest poetry in the world is in the authorized or King James's version of the Bible, which is not only a translation but also, as to its appearance in print, in identifiable neither with verse nor with prose in English, but rather with a cadence owing something to both. There may be a better way of putting the question by the simple test alluded to above. When people are presented with a series of passages drawn indifferently from poems and stories, but all printed as prose, they will show a dominant inclination to identify everything they possibly can as prose. This will be true, surprisingly enough, even if the poem rhymes and will often be true even if the poem in its original typographical arrangement would have been familiar to them. The reason seems to be absurdly plain. Readers recognize poetry by its appearance on the page, and they respond to the convention whereby they recognize it by reading it aloud in a quite a different tone of voice from that which they apply to prose, which indeed they scarcely read aloud at all. It should be added that they make this distinction also without reading aloud. Even in silence, they confer upon a piece of poetry an attention that differs from what they give to prose in two ways, especially in tone and in pace. In place of further worrying over definitions, it may be both a relief and illumination to exhibit certain plain and mighty differences between prose and poetry by a comparison. In the following passages, a prose writer and a poet are talking about the same subject growing older. Between the ages of 30 and 90, the weight of our muscles falls by 30% and the power we can exert likewise. The weight of our brains falls from an average of 3.3 pound to 2.27 pound as cells die and are not replaced. Gordon Rattray Taylor. Before objecting that a simple comparison cannot possibly cover all the possible ranges of poetry and prose compared, the reader should consider for a moment what differences are exhibited. The passages are oddly parallel, hence comparable even in a formal sense, for both consist of the several items of catalogue under the general title of Growing Old. The significant differences are of tone, pace, and object of attention. If the prose passage interests itself in the neutral, material, miserable properties of the process, while the poetry interests itself in what the process will signify to someone going through it, and that is not accidental but of the essence. If one reads the prose passage with an interest in being informed and noting the parallel constructions without being affected by them either in tone or in pace, while reading the poetry with a sense of considerable gravity and solemnity, that too is of the essence. One might say as tersely as possible that the difference between prose and poetry is most strikingly shown in the two uses of the verb to fall. So two passages which have been put for contrast. One, the former is from prose. So I read it out again. Between the ages of 30 and 90, the weight of our muscles falls by 30%, and the power we can exert likewise. The number of nerve fibers in a nerve trunk falls by a quarter. The weight of our brains falls from an average of 3 pound to 2.27 pound as cells die and are not replaced. So, the poetic passage, how it should be expressed in poetic form. Let me disclose the gifts reserved for age, to set a crown upon your lifetime's effort. First, the cold friction of expiring sense without enchantment offering to promise, but bitter tastelessness of shadow fruit as body and soul begin to fall asunder. Second, second, the conscious impotence of rage at human folly and the laceration of laughter at what ceases to amuse. And last, the rending pain of a reenactment of all that you have done and been. So this excerpt is from T.S. Eliot's Four Quadrants. Before objecting that a simple comparison cannot possibly cover all the possible images of poetry and prose, compare the reader should consider for a moment what differences are exhibited. The passages are oddly parallel, hence comparable even in a formal sense, for both consist of several items of a catalogue under the general title of the growing old. The significant differences are of tone, pace, and object of attention. If the prose passage inserts itself in the neutral, material, miserable properties of the process, while the poetry interests itself in what the process will signify to someone going through it, that is not accidental but of the essence. If one reads the prose passage with an interest in being informed, noting the parallel constructions without being affected by them, either in tone or in pace, while reading the poetry with a sense of considerable gravity and solemnity, that too is of the essence. One might say as tersely as possible that the difference between prose and poetry is most strikingly shown in the two uses of the verb to fall. The number of nerve fibers in a nerve trunk falls by a quarter as body and soul begin to fall asunder. It should be specified here that the important differences exhibited by the comparison belong to the present age. In each period, speaking for poetry in English at any rate, the dividing line will be seen to come at a different place. In Elizabethan times, the diction of prose was much closer to that of poetry than it later became. And in the 18th century, authors saw nothing strange about writing in couplets about subjects that later would automatically and compulsorily belong to prose. For example, horticulture, botany, even dentistry. Here is not the place for entering into a discussion of such a chapter in the history of ideas, but the changes involved in the relation of poetry and prose are vast, and the number of ways people can describe and view the world are powerfully influenced by developments in science and society. So, now I will discuss poetic diction and its experience. Returning to the comparison, it is observable that though the diction of the poem is well within what could be commanded by a moderately well-educated speaker, it is at the same time well outside the range of terms in fact employed by such a speaker in daily occasions. It is a diction very conscious as it were of its power of choosing terms with an effect of peculiar precision and of combining the terms into phrases with the same effect of peculiar precision, and also of combining sounds with the same effect of peculiar precision. Doubtless, the precision of the prose passage is greater in the more obvious property of dealing in the miserable, but the poet attempts a precision with respect to what is not in the same sense miserable, nor even in the same sense accessible to observation. The distinction is perhaps just that made by the French scientist and philosopher Blaise Pascal in discriminating the spirits of geometry and fineness, and if one speaks of effects of precision rather than of precision itself, that serves to distinguish one's sense that the artwork is always somewhat removed from what people are pleased to call the real world, operating instead in Immanuel Kant's shrewd formula by exhibiting purposefulness without purpose. To much the same point is what Samuel Taylor Coleridge remembers having learned from his schoolmaster. I learned from him that poetry, even that of the loftiest and seemingly that of the wildest odes, had a logic of its own, as severe as that of science, and more difficult because more subtle, more complex, and dependent on more and more fugitive causes. In the truly great poets, he would say there is a reason assignable not only for every word but for the possession of every word. Biographia Literaria, Chapter 1. Perhaps this is a somewhat exaggerated, as it is almost always an unprovable claim, illustrating also a propensity for competing with the prestige of science on something like its own terms. But the last remark in particular illuminates the same author's terser formulation. Prose is equal to words in the best order. Poetry is equal to the best words in the best order. This attempt at definition impeccable because informatively that style in writing was the best words in the best order, which may be much to the same effect as Louis Armstrong saying on being asked to define jazz, "Baby, if you got to ask the question, you are never going to know the answer." Or the painter Marcel Duchamp's elegant remark on what psychologists call the problem of perception. If no solution, then maybe no problem. This species of gnomic riddling remark may be determined for the artistic attitude toward the definition of every sort, and its skepticism is not confined to definitions of poetry but extends to definitions of anything whatever, directing one not to dictionaries but to experience, and above all to use. Anyone with a watch can tell you what time it is, said Valerie, but who can tell you what is time? Happily, if poetry is almost impossible to define, it is extremely easy to recognize in experience. Even untutored children are rarely in doubt about it when it appears. Little Jack Jingle, he used to live single, but when he got tired of this kind of life, he left off being single and lived with his wife. It might be objected that this little verse is not of sufficient import and weight to serve as an exemplar of poetry. It ought to be remembered, though, that it has given people pleasure so that they continue to say it until and after it was written down nearly 2 centuries ago. The verse has survived, and its survival has something to do with pleasure, with delight, and while it still lives. But how many more imposing words of language, epic poems, books of science, philosophy, theology have gone down, deservedly or not, into dust and silence. It has obviously a form and arrangement of sounds in relation to thoughts that somehow makes it agreeable, nonsense closed, complete, agreeable nonsense closed, complete and decisive. But this somewhat muddled matter of form deserves a heading and an instance all to itself. People nowadays who speak of form in poetry almost always mean such externals as the regular measure and rhyme, and most often they mean to get rid of these in favor of the freedom they suppose must follow upon the absence of form in this limited sense. In this connection, the poet J.V. Cunningham speaks of a convergence of forms and forms of disparate orders, adding, it is the coincidence of forms that locks in the poem. For a poem is composed of internal and intellectual forms as well as forms externally imposed and pre-existing in a particular instance, and these may be sufficient without regular measure and rhyme if the intellectual forms are absent, as in greeting card verse and advertising jingles. No amount of thumping and banging will supply the want. Forsythia, 1966, by Mary Ellen Salt, is an example of concrete poetry, a genre that lacks such traditional poetic elements as a regular measures or rhyme, and instead takes exclusively visual forms. Form, in effect, is like the duff nut that may be said to be nothing in a circle of something or something around nothing. It is either the outside of and inside, as when people speak of good form or bourgeois formalism, or the inside of and outside, as in the scholastic saying that the soul is the form of the body. Taking this principle together with what Cunningham says of the matter, one may now look at a very short and very powerful poem with a view to distinguishing the forms or schemes of which it is made. It was written by Rudyard Kipling, a great English poet, somewhat sunken in reputation, probably on account of misinterpretations having to do more with imputed politics that with his poetry and its subject. One of Sadie's epitaphs for the dead of World War I is a soldier shot by his comrades for cowardice in battle. I could not look on death, which being lone men led me to him, blindfold and alone. The aim of following observations and reflections is to distinguish as clearly as possible. Distinguish without dividing the feelings evoked by the subject, so grim, horrifying, tending to helpless sorrow and despair, from the feelings which might better be thought of as meanings evoked by careful contemplation of the poem in its manifold and somewhat subtle ways of handling the subject, leading the reader on to a view of the strange delight intrinsic to art, whose mirroring and shielding power allows him to contemplate the world's horrible realities without being turned to stone. There is first the obvious external form of a rhyme closed couplet in iambic pentameter, that is, 5 poetic feet, each consisting of an unstressed followed by a stressed syllable per line. There is second, the obvious external form of a single sentence balanced in our grammatical units with in counterpoint with the metrical form. There is third, the conventional form belonging to the epitaph and reflecting back to antiquity. It is terse enough to be cut in stone and light-lipped also, perhaps for other reasons such as the speaker's shame. There is fourth, the fictional form belonging to the epitaph, according to which the dead man is supposed to be saying the words himself. There is fifth, especially poignant in the instance, the real form behind or within the fictional one, for the reader is aware that in reality it is not the dead man speaking, nor are his feelings the only ones the reader is receiving, but that the comrades who were forced to execute him may themselves have made up these two lines with their incalculably complex and exquisite balance of scorn, awe, guilt, and consideration, even to tenderness for the dead soldier. There is sixth, the metaphorical form, with its many resonances, ranging from the tragic through the pathetic to irony and apology. Dying in battle is spoken of in language relating it to a social occasion, in drawing room or court. The coward's fear is implicitly represented as merely the timorousness and embarrassment one might feel about being introduced to a somewhat superior and majestic person, so that the soldiers responsible for killing him are seen as sympathetically helping him through a difficult moment in the realm of manners. In addition, there is seventh, a linguistic or syntactical form with at least a couple of tricks to it, The second clause, with its reminiscence of Latin construction, participates in the meaning by conferring a Roman stoicism and archaic gravity on this saying, remembering that the soldiers in the poem had been British schoolboys not long before. The reader might hear the remote sense of a whole lost world, whole, whole lost world built upon Greek and Roman models, and the last epithets blindfold and alone, while in the literal acceptation they clearly refer to the coward, show a distinct tendency to waver over and apply mysteriously to death as well, sitting there waiting, blindfold and alone. One might add another form, the eighth, composed of the balance of sounds from the obvious likeness in the rhyme down to the subtleties and refinements beneath, the ability of coarse analysis to discriminate. And even there one could not be quite at an end. An overall principle remains the compression of what might have been epic or five-act tragedy into two lines, or the poet's precise election of a single strand to carry what the novelist, if he did his business properly, would have been hundreds of pages arranging it. It is not at all to be inferred that the poet composed this poem in the manner of the above laborious analysis of its strands. The whole insistence rather is that he did not catalogue 8 or 10 forms and assemble them into a poem. More likely it just came to him, but the example may serve to indicate how many modes of the mind go together in this articulation of an implied drama and the tension among many possible sentiments that might arise in response to it. In this way, by the coincidence of forms that lurks in the poem, one may see how to answer a question that often arises about poems. Though their thoughts are commonplace, they themselves mysteriously are not. One may answer on the basis of the example and the inferences produced from it, that a poem is not so much a thought as it is a mind talk with it, and it will talk back, telling you many things that you might have thought of for yourself, but somehow didn't until it brought them together. Doubtless, a poem is a much simplified model for the mind, but it might still be one of the best models available on this great theme. However, it will be best to proceed not by definition but by parable and interception. Poetry is a mode of thought, the protean way, the protean encounter way. In the fourth book of the Odyssey, Homer tells the following strange tale after the war at Troy. Menelaus wanted very much to get home, but was held up in Egypt for want of a wind because, as he later told Telemachus, he had not sacrificed enough to the gods. Ever jealous the gods are, he said, that We men mind their dues, but because the gods work both ways, it was on the advice of a goddess, uh, Idothea, Idothi, that Menelaus went to consult Proteus, the old one of the sea, as one might consult a travel agency. Proteus was not easy to consult. He was herding seals, and the seals stank he, even though Ambrosia, uh, I, Idothi had provided. And when Menelaus crept up close, disguised as a seal, and grabbed him, Proteus turned into a lion, a dragon, a leopard, a boar, a film of water, and a high branched tree. But Menelaus managed to hang on until Proteus gave up and was himself again. Whereupon Menelaus asked him to one great question: How do I get home? And Proteus told him, You had better go back to Egypt and sacrifice to the gods some more. This story may be taken as a parable about poetry. A man has an urgent question about his way in the world. He already knows the answer, but it fails to satisfy him. So, at great inconvenience, hardship, and even peril, he consults a powerful and refractory spirit who tries to evade his question by turning into anything in the world. Then, when the spirit says he cannot get free of the man, and only then he answers the man's question not simply with a commonplace, but with the same commonplace the man had been dissatisfied with before. This story may be taken as a parable about poetry. A man has an urgent question about his way in the world. It may be a foolish story, no? A foolish story. All the same, it is to be observed that Menelaus did get home, and it was a heroic thing to have hung on to Proteus through those terrifying changes and compelled him to be himself and answer up. Nor does it matter in the least to the story that Menelaus personally may have been a disagreeable old fool as well as cuckold. A poet also has one great and simple question, simple thought. It may take many forms indeed. Geoffrey Chaucer put it as well as anyone could, and in 3 lines at that. What is this world? What asketh man to have? Now with his love, now in his cold grave, alone, without any company. This is from the Night's Tale. And a poet gets the simple answer he might expect, the one the world grudgingly gives to anyone who asks such a question. The world is this way, not that way, and you ask for more than you will be given, which the poet, being scarcely more fool than his fellow men, knew already, but on the path from question to answer, hanging on to the slippery disguiser and shapelifter Proteus. He will see many marvels. He will follow the metamorphosis of things in the metamorphosis of their phrases, and he will be so elated and ecstatic in the realm of wonders that the voice in which he speaks these things down even to the stupid, obvious, and commonplace answer will be to his hearers a solace and a happiness in the midst of sorrows. When I do count the clock that tells the time and see the brave day sunk in hideous night, when I behold the violet past prime and sable curls all silvered over with white, when lofty trees I see barren of leaves which erst from heat did canopy the herd, and summer's green all girded up in sheaves borne on that bier with white and bristly beard. Then of the beauty do I question make, that thou among the wastes of time must go, since sweets and beauties must themselves forsake and die as fast as they see others grow, and nothing against time's scythe can make defense save breed to brave him when he takes thee hence. Shakespeare. This is from Shakespeare's sonnet number 12. Like like Menelaus, the poet asks a simple question to which, moreover, he already knows the unsatisfying answer. Question and answer, one might say, have to be present, although of themselves they seem to do nothing much, but they assert the limits of a journey to be taken. They are necessary but not sufficient conditions of what really seems to matter here. The Protean encountered itself, the grasping and hanging on to the powerful and refractory spirit in its slippery transformations of a single force flowing through clock, day, violet, graying hair, trees dropping their leaves, the harvest in which, by a peculiarly ceremonial transmutation, the grain man lives by is seen without contradiction as the corpse he comes to. As for the answer to this question, it is not surprising, nor meant to be surprising. It is only just. On this point, that the answer comes as no surprise, poets show an agreement that quite transcends the differences of periods and schools. Alexander Pope's formula, what oft was thought but never so well expressed, sometimes considered as the epitome of a shallow and parochial decorum, is not in essence other than this offered by John Keats. I think poetry should surprise by a fine excess and not by singularity. It should strike the reader as a wording of his own highest thoughts and appear almost a remembrance. So, in a letter to John Taylor in 1818, Keats wrote, in the 20th century, Robert Frost was strikingly in agreement. A word about recognition. In literature, it is our business to give people the thing that will make them say, "Oh yes, I know what you mean." It is never to tell them something they don't know, but something they know and hadn't thought of saying. It must be something they recognize. So, letter to John Bartlett in Modern Poetics, edited by James Skelly in 1965. And the American poet and critic John Crow Ransom gives the thought a cryptically and characteristically elegant variation. Poetry is the kind of knowledge by which we must know that we have arranged that we shall not know otherwise. Perhaps this point about recognition might be carried further to the extreme at which it would be seen to pose the problem of how poetry, which as its highest has always carried at least implicitly a kind of Platonism and claimed to give, if not knowledge itself, what was more important, a form to knowledge, can survive the triumph of scientific materialism and a positive minded to skepticism about everything in the world except its own self, where it turns credulous extremely. The poet's adjustment over 2 or 3 centuries to a Newtonian cosmos, Kantian criticism, and the spectral universe portrayed by physics has conspicuously not been a happy one and has led alternately or simultaneously to the extremes of rejection of reason and speaking in tongues on the one hand, and the hysterical claim that poetry saved the world on the other. But of this let the Protean parable speak at it will. And still, for all that, the poem remains beautiful. It continues to move both the young who come to it still innocent of their dear time's waste, and the old who have sorrows to match its sorrows. So, the greatest of our poets have said, or not so much said, perhaps, as indicated by their fables, though nowadays people mostly sing a different tune. To be as the gods, to be rejoined with the beloved, the world forgotten, sacrament or Cunningham. Homer, of course, is only telling an old story and promises humankind nothing that is left to be restricted, and in that respect, poetry, as one critic puts it, must always be a ship that is wrecked on entering the harbor, and yet the greatest poetry sings always at the end of transcendence, while seeing clearly and saying plainly the wickedness and terror and beauty of the world. It is at the same time humming to itself, so that one overhears rather than hears, as will be well. So this way I have completed my lecture, dear audience, dear listeners. So I would like to conclude here right now. Thank you. Thank you for your patiently hearing.